I'm your host, Annie Bowles, and this is News du Jour. Hey, you guys, and welcome back to the News du Jour. Can you believe less than a week until the midterm elections? Stuff is really heating up in some races here in Oklahoma, and I'm sure in your home states as well. Things are getting down to the wire. Hope you guys have a plan to vote. And speaking of, a bunch of our stories do have to do with elections today in the U.S. and otherwise. We have a bunch of smaller stories today, so we're going to bounce around a little bit, but let's go ahead and jump in. First up, we have Brazil's new old president. So Brazil's president throughout the pandemic was a guy named Bolsonaro. He was more conservative, but really he's known for majorly dropping the ball on COVID. You know how President Trump famously said that if he had, quote unquote, just let it rip, that things would have been, really bad? Well, Bolsonaro really tested that theory. He allowed COVID-19 to really run rampant throughout Brazil, and it had one of the worst death tolls world over. A Senate committee there looked into the deaths and determined that there was a quote-unquote disregard for human life during the pandemic. And now his chickens are really coming home to roost. His liberal rival won and will take his place as president. Only this rival, he's been president before. And during his time in office, just like Bolsonaro, he was engulfed in scandal as well. His name is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and he was literally a shoe shiner who rose to the peak of political power in Brazil. His story was inspiring to the average person. But once it was discovered that his administration was taking bribes for government contracts, it looked like he was pretty sunk. But the investigation was a bit murky, and ultimately in 2021, the case was thrown out by the Supreme Court of Brazil. So Da Silva ran again, and he just won. Will he do better this time? Will he work to serve the average Brazilian? We'll just have to wait and see. And next up, we have another campaign-related story. So we are going to be discussing the burglary of a campaign office in Arizona. So speaking of political races engulfed in scandal, here in the U.S., we have a scandal of our own brewing. In a Watergate-esque moment, a man has now been charged in the burglary of a Democratic campaign office. But what is unclear is whether or not this break had anything to do with politics. This man went on to burglarize another property later in the day. But the campaign office of Arizona gubernatorial candidate Katie Hobbs has reportedly received, quote, hundreds of death threats and threats of violence over the course of this campaign, end quote. They seem to believe that this was somehow an act of intimidation, either orchestrated by their opponents or voters who stand with their opponents. Their race is very tight, so could a little dirt on the other candidate help at this late stage? Absolutely. Does that mean that they are guilty of this sabotage? Definitely not. But investigators are looking into the break-in with a fine-tooth comb, and hopefully we'll get to the bottom of the intruder's intentions soon. So next up, we have to discuss Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen breaking up. So you guys have probably heard by now that Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen have officially called it quits on their 13-year marriage. If you guys remember, there was a big day where Tom officially, quote unquote, retired from his legendary football career. But he went back on that and started playing again. And apparently, this was a very big deal to Gisele and his family, as the two separately have cited this as a source of tension in their relationship. Gisele said, quote, "This is a very violent sport, and I have my children, and I would like him to be more present," end quote. He said of the game, quote, "These past 2 months, I've realized that my place is still on the field and not in the stands. The time will come, but it's not now," end quote. I think this one is pretty cut and dry, you guys, but an enormously famous power couple is splitting up. So what is around the corner for the both of them? Only time will tell. And next up, again, today we just have a bunch of smaller stories for you guys, just little bite-sized tidbits. But next up, we're discussing salary transparency in New York City. I thought this story was so interesting and the change so needed. You know how it sucks to find out that a coworker has the same title and tenure but makes more money than you for absolutely no reason? Well, this has been happening all over the country for generations, and this practice has really affected women and people of color negatively, who have been traditionally undervalued in the workplace. But now, everyone, at least in New York City, will be able to see salary ranges as required by law for every workplace with 4 people or more. States like Colorado, California, and Washington have plans for similar laws that will go into effect in 2023. They're calling this salary transparency, and hopefully it will help hinder the wage gap, or at least one can hope. And lastly for today, we're discussing the collapse of a suspension bridge in India. So at least 140 people were killed in the collapse of an over 100-year-old pedestrian bridge in India. There were reportedly 350 to 400 people on the bridge when it simply fell apart and landed everyone in the Machu River. It is thought that the company who owns the bridge may have rushed repairs and reopened before it was ready for visitors, and oversold tickets past capacity on the day of the event. You see, built back in 1880, this 755-foot-long bridge was a major tourist attraction, and a lot of people who ended up dying in this tragic event were children and elderly people visiting with family, and they didn't survive the fall into the water. The bridge also had this kind of mesh covering on the top and the sides, and some people became trapped inside of the bridge, sticking out of the water. Rescue workers started by saving everyone who was alive in the water, and then began recovery missions searching for anyone who may still be in the river but deceased. The whole area is in an absolute time of mourning over this tragedy. Our hearts go out to everyone affected. And that is the news du jour. Today, I wanted to leave you guys with the quote, "Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift." If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of our podcast. For $7.99 a month, you can unlock tons of perks like breaking news text messages so that you're never out of the loop. Tons of bonus episodes are already up there ready for you to binge, and a discussion board full of networking opportunities and much more. Go to www.patreon.com/sugarfree media today to become a patron. This is the best way to support our show. Our patrons make News du Jour possible. But a couple other ways to support our podcast are rate and review on whatever podcast platform you use to listen, share on your social media, you have influence, tell your friends, family, and colleagues that you love News du Jour and why you listen. You can also follow us on social media under sugarfreemedia.co on Instagram, just sugarfreemedia, all one word, on TikTok, and sugarfree_media on Twitter. We also have a weekend newsletter called Dreamers Digest that's full of dreamy content recommendations for your weekend and a life update from yours truly. Sign up today on our website, www.sugarfreemedia.co. Our music is by Joey Lavoie and Nicholas Foster. Our cover art is by Hannah Pierce Photography. Our Sugar Free Media logo is by Catherine Jezik Designs. Any twinkling or little footsteps you might hear in the background are by my dog, Rhett. He's a rescue pup and always records with me. We appreciate you listening and look forward to telling you about the news again next time on News du Jour.
Broadcasting from Oklahoma.